It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we begin this morning on slightly strange territory. The contempt of court laws are pretty strict and generally pretty clear. There is some wiggle room. There always is with the law. That's why we have lawyers. If there wasn't any wiggle room, you wouldn't need lawyers, would you? You'd just have it all handed down from on high and we'd know exactly where we stood and what we could and couldn't do. So we can't talk about the case that has prompted conversations about armed police. We can't talk about the specific case. We can't really say anything about it, except, oddly, that the Home Secretary has done on Twitter, which, to my untutored eye, to my amateurish eye, looks at the very least to be profoundly unwise and very unprofessional. But we're talking about Suella Braverman, so there are perhaps no surprises there. The question really of what armed police are unhappy about, however, is much broader than a single case, much bigger than a single case, and I'm interested, frankly, in what is going on, because the idea of the police officers to whom we entrust an awful lot, actually. These are the people most likely to be coming up against armed criminals, and there's a debt of honour, a debt of gratitude there that I'm afraid has to transcend. And I know it's easier for perhaps a white bloke to say this than some other members of our community, but that has to transcend some of the criticisms and concerns about the police in general, which are greater, I think, at the moment than at any point I can practically remember in my life. But they do deserve our protection. They deserve our respect and support in many ways, for the same reason I would argue that firefighters do. You know, nobody's perfect, nobody's infallible, everybody needs to be held to account. But there are life choices, there are career choices that involve more danger, more personal danger than the rest of us routinely face. And I think that there is a sort of commensurate debt from society to those people. I don't know how this reaches your ears, by the way. It's a very personal perspective and perhaps a slightly sentimental one. It's not exactly objective. I reserve a different attitude to public servants in general than I do to other members of the workforce. But when it comes to particularly the emergency services, if you like, then for all the problems and all the scandals that we've endured in recent years, I still have an emotional relationship with people who risk their lives to protect ours. I just do. Or people whose career decisions have been made according to looking after the rest of us, which allows us to bring the health service into this sort of broad brushstroke. So all of that is background, really, to the decision by a number of officers to, and I think the language is to hand in their cards. In other words, to hand back their weapons, effectively speaking, as a consequence of one of their number being charged with murder. It means the Ministry of Defence could be stepping into the breach and replacing armed police on London streets for the first time in over 100 years. Now, I am, and the people answering the phones today will have to work even harder at this than I do, but I am stressing repeatedly that this is not a conversation about a specific case. It can't be, because that would bring us straight into contempt of court territory. But it is, except to say that a colleague has been charged with murdering an unarmed black man, as the Daily Mail chooses to report it this morning. And as a consequence of that, officers have handed back their weapons and essentially withdrawn themselves from active duty. I'd like to start by asking why. 0345 6060 973. Now, that is a question to which answers will need a degree of expertise and experience which I do not have. So let's guard against that. The idea that the police should be held to somehow lower standards of scrutiny than the rest of us is one that I would reject. But it's also perfectly possible that they are currently being held to higher standards than is fair or reasonable. Just because they've handed in their guns doesn't mean they're in the right. But equally, just because they are police officers and members of a particularly controversial section of the police doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong. So why have you or why have they handed in their guns or your guns? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 So that kind of admits the possibility that we don't know enough about the current situation to have an informed conversation. I think we probably do, that the broader conversation is about what should happen when a police officer shoots somebody. You know, there was a terrible case, I think before I even started working here, which was a million years ago, a bloke shot dead carrying a table leg through London because someone had reported that it might be a gun. I don't like, and I'm afraid with Suella Braverman in the Home Office, I wouldn't put anything past her when it comes to populism and, for want of a better word, epic thickness. It's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible situation to be put in. I'd go so far as to suggest that she's even worse than Priti Patel, which is not a phrase I ever thought I'd utter. But here we are. So with her in the Home Office, formerly an Attorney General, by the way, her CV boasted, I don't know if you're aware of this, a little nugget from my next book, but it's in the public domain. Her CV boasted about having contributed to a legal textbook. And when the author of the legal textbook saw this on her CV, he made it public that she hadn't made any contribution at all to the legal textbook. This is all we know, really, about her career as a lawyer. And the help that she'd given to the author amounted to doing some photocopying. So I don't want this to be a lazy conversation. I don't want it to be a binary conversation. Police good, therefore can do anything. Police bad, therefore should all be in the dock. But I do have a problem with, and that's why I've mentioned Suella Braverman, with a subcurrent, an undercurrent of this conversation that seems to be the police should be able to shoot people without any more questions being asked. I've got a deep problem with that for two reasons. Number one, it's ugly, just on an objective level. And number two, and I've heard some other conversations about it this morning, it seems to me that people's opinions are often driven by the question of how likely it would be that they'd find themselves on the wrong end of that bullet. And when that is the case, you're going to bring in everything from socioeconomic class to ethnicity to geography to, well, you name it. But I, as a middle-class, middle-aged white man, do not feel at any risk whatsoever of being erroneously or illegally shot dead by a police officer. Maybe I'm being naive, maybe I'm not. But I can imagine other sections of our society, other sections of our community who are as blameless as me in most contexts, being rather less confident about that happening. So I just want to guard against this question being answered according to who and what the respondent is, rather than what sort of society we want to live in. Yeah? I think that's really important. Do you want to live? How much scrutiny and investigation should a police officer face when they shoot an unarmed citizen dead? Up to and including a murder charge, theoretically speaking. The numbers you need are 0345 6060 Then we've got a question about how we feel about armed police, armed soldiers routinely policing London streets, something that we haven't seen in over 100 years in this country. It's kind of scary, isn't it? I mean, we don't see armed officers very often, so we probably wouldn't be bumping into armed soldiers on a regular basis, but you know, you do occasionally encounter them, and to see soldiers in uniform with guns on the streets of London it's a strange image, isn't it? So we may do a little side order of that as well. But the number you need in the first instance as to what is going on here, and can we together navigate it in a way that avoids that little pitfall I just described of having a response to the question of armed police shooting unarmed civilians that is framed really by either consciously or subconsciously the question of how likely you are to be on the wrong end of that bullet. 0345 60 60973. We live in a society where almost everybody paid to comment upon social issues is immensely privileged and very much divorced from the reality of people on the receiving end of those social issues. I mean, most obviously with poverty. Is there any more hideous sound than that of a well-heeled pundit questioning the existence of poverty or denying the existence of poverty? The notion of people who come to the end of their spending money long before the end of the week or the end of the month, and there is literally nothing left, whether it's for food or shampoo or nappies. There is literally nothing. So it doesn't matter whether it's 10p, 20p, £1, £5 or £10. There is nothing left. And you can open a newspaper on pretty much any day of the week and find the people like me who are paid to offer our opinions on issues in the news just absolutely incapable of understanding what it's like to run out of money, what it is like to have zero spending power until the next check or the next payment arrives. And I don't want that to happen here. I don't want this to be a conversation that is conducted entirely according to how likely you think you are to be shot, or your loved ones are to be shot dead, despite not being armed, by a police officer who is not supposed to shoot people who aren't armed, but who in the course of discharging their duties will inevitably run the risk of doing so. And that's a risk that society has to accommodate, not just the individuals concerned. All right? It's 10:15. You know the number. The phone lines are open, and it should be interesting, this, not least because I don't think if we all put our brains in gear, I don't think there are obvious answers to any of these questions. 18 minutes after 10 is the time. So what is going on and what should be going on are questions which really we could apply to almost every topic we discuss together. Just insert the details and the facts of the specific case. And of course, the specific case that prompts the conversation about armed police and indeed prompted or has prompted armed police to hand in their tickets, effectively to hand in their guns as a colleague faces murder charges, is a case to which we cannot veer near. We can't go anywhere near it. I cannot make that clear enough. Thomas is in Bury St Edmunds. Thomas, what would you like to say?
Hello, how are you doing?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
So just a few points to make. First-time caller, I've listened to your show quite a lot.
Thank you.
The first one I want to say is I 100% believe that the police and armed police or normal sort of working police should be investigated when these sort of incidents do occur. I'm currently serving in the armed forces, and I know, should I be out on operations, if I discharge my weapon, I will be investigated just in the same way that the police would be.
Possibly even more so, because you've got the Geneva Convention to worry about as well, haven't you?
Well, yeah, it's always there. There's always training, always reminders. Carry cards with us to ensure that we have the exact verbatim word of law on our side as well. Obviously, I'd say that, you know, armed police and the armed forces, they run parallel, but they are different in many ways as well.
Yes.
The police's first job is always to 100% try and diffuse the situation at all costs, whereas, you know, there could be slightly different rules. The second part I'd like to say as well, I don't mean to sort of call you out on anything. Very
feel free.
You said on the sort of intro to this question, this would be the first time in over 100 years that the armed forces have been out with police. During the Olympics and after the Manchester bombings at the Ariana Grande concert, I have been out patrolling large cities with members of the police, helping to police during these sort of high-end
I think
times.
I misspoke there. It's the context would be replacing armed police as opposed to supplementing or complementing armed police. So that's where the line of the first time in over 100 years comes from.
Oh, okay. that could be a misunderstanding on my part.
No, I think it's probably a misspeak on my part. But can we stop being so polite? This is a radio phone-in show.
I should just start yelling abuse at you.
Yes, thank you. Exactly.
But as I mentioned before, I believe that obviously I'm speaking to you as a sort of white cisgendered male.
Right. Yes.
So I'm in a similar situation to you, where perhaps we are less likely if we found ourselves in that sort of situation, whatever may happen. But I still wholeheartedly believe that any action anybody takes, whether you're police, armed police, whether you're in the armed forces, whatever, if you put somebody else's life in danger or perhaps take that life, you should be investigated, because to make that decision, you must be able to sort of prove why. You must be able to give reasoning as to why, otherwise you wouldn't be able to make that decision in confidence.
So the officers risking their lives to keep us safe have my full backing, and I will do everything in my power to support them. They mustn't fear ending up in the dock for carrying out their duties. That's the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, speaking. And it's strange, to say the least, that there is, to me at least, some clear blue water between what you've just said and what she appears to be saying in those tweets. Well,
I think to say that, if you should, perform the act, or if you should do something like that, you shouldn't expect to be able to explain yourself, I think is roaming into really quite dangerous territory of where, I can do what I want and no one can investigate me for it anyway. So why don't I just make my life easier and do what I want? I think we could end up in very, very murky water if we were to say, armed police can respond to an incident and don't have to fear any sort of court time.
Well, as someone who routinely wields a weapon in the course of your duties, I'm more comfortable with you saying that than me just as a gob on a stick sitting behind a microphone. But I'm seeing it similarly, and that phrase there, I mean, it doesn't seem very carefully chosen language. They mustn't fear ending up in the dock for carrying out their duties. But what if they have gone beyond their duties, or what if they have acted in a way that can't really be accounted for according to duties? That is essentially what these conversations are always about, and that's why the CPS imposes the same criteria on police officers that it would impose on anybody else when deciding whether or not to pursue a prosecution or press charges. Thank you, Thomas. I don't know. I'm not confident I nearly said as a trained journalist, but I don't think I'd get away with that, would I, with you? But I'm not confident as a journalist, as an alleged journalist who has received legal training. I'm not completely clear about what I can and can't say about what the Home Secretary has said about a live criminal case. That's how mad it is that she's waded in her size 4s in this fashion. I'm not sure what I can, if I were to be really careful, and I always want to be, and I'm expected to be, I don't think I would have been able to say what the Home Secretary has said, which means I'm a little bit nervous about repeating what the Home Secretary has said in this context, which is just a mark of how mad everything is. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. Hannah is in London, which is a suitably vague description that makes me think the first thing you're going to tell us is your qualifications for commenting on this issue.
Right, yeah, correct, James. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I am a retired ex-firearms incident commander.
Gosh.
Have worked in London and also in the north of England.
Right.
Keeping it very vague because I also have a very close relative who is a current serving firearms officer.
Okay.
So although I have been retired a while, I would feel I do have my finger on the pulse slightly.
Clearly.
As to what training goes on, accountability. So fire away, what do you want to ask? And hopefully I can answer it for you.
Why have the cards been handed in, as you understand it?
I would suspect, and I'm, again, only reading between the lines,
Yes.
To be a firearms officer, they go through an extremely rigorous training process. It is drilled into them the implications of what will happen, very similar to what the Army officer just said,
Yes.
what will happen if they pull the trigger. The same when I was an incident commander. So an incident commander is the person who puts the firearms or authorises the firearms officers to be in that position,
Right.
to ultimately use their judgment as to whether to effectively take somebody's life. That is the ultimate. They know that inside out, back to front. They're through their training, very similar to military. It's drilled into them. Pulling the trigger is the last thing they want to do. They have systems to escalate, de-escalate. It's the last thing they want to do. There will be something, we know not what, that has triggered them, excuse the pun, perhaps not quite the right word, to go, that wasn't in line with what our expectations would be if we were put in a similar position. And the implications for those officers and their families, yes, they know they will be scrutinised. They expect all of that, quite rightly. We're not America. We do not want to be America. But there will be something behind the scenes, and we do not know what, which will have made them very cautious. And what the last thing anybody wants is when they are in that situation, that split second of indecision and doubt could cost them their own lives, or members of the public.
So
exactly.
You, for people not understanding fully why we're conducting this conversation in such vague terms, you can't speak specifically about the case that has prompted this response from officers in MO19, but your contention is that it will be very specific to circumstances in which MO19 currently finds itself. This is people who know a lot more about it than we do, arriving at conclusions based on what they think they know.
Yes, and that is the only logical thing I can see, given all my specific training, which, granted, may be out of date now, and the training that I know from a current firearms officer. I've also spoken to people who have pulled the trigger, who have and I know what the debrief looks like, how this lives with them for years. But we need them to be confident in doing their job to protect us, the public. And if they are not confident, they don't have to do this. The pressure.
But these decisions are taken by the CPS, and the stress of a case notwithstanding, nobody can really argue that the Criminal Prosecution Service shouldn't have a role to play in these sort of circumstances.
No. Absolutely not, and we will not know. Again. Ultimately, there will be a trial, and that is correct. There will be, again, information that has gone to the CPS. They don't take these decisions lightly.
Well, precisely.
And they will have made their conclusions based on the evidence that was put to them. Then it will be put to a jury, and quite rightly, a jury will decide whether this was murder or not. That's the legal system, and I actually don't have an issue with that. It will come. It will be concluded eventually, and the facts will come out.
Then we come back to confusion about why the officers have taken the action that they've taken in the interim. Then, and I don't think either of us can go any further than that, can we?
No, and they won't take that decision lightly.
No, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Because they undergo so much training, and you have to be a certain type of individual to want to do that. I never wanted to hold a gun. I never wanted to point it at anybody. I took the more about the decision. And the rationale that goes behind it, the documentation, the justification, and quite rightly so. I don't dispute what
I get that, but for balance, for want of a better word, the Baroness Casey, and that report was only published in March of this year, well-resourced with elitist attitudes and toxic cultures of bullying, racism, sexism and ableism. Normal rules do not seem to apply or be applied in MO19. Junior ranking officers and trainers hold disproportionate power in their relationships with senior officers because of the importance of their blue card firearm status to Met operations. I just mentioned that because it's pertinent, and I know you weren't sort of engaging in hagiographies of every officer who carries a gun, but we need to be reminded that everybody's human.
Correct, and please do not, as an ex-Met officer, I started my career in the Met, I will just say I am as an aside issue, I am gobsmacked about what's going on in the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah.
I cannot understand or justify what is going on there. I can't speak for the Metropolitan Police. There may be issues going on there. Please let's not tar every firearms officer or everybody you see with a gun.
Quite the opposite. No, I completely agree. Yeah, I'm late for the news. That's the only reason that I'm moving on. I wanted to hear everything you had to say, and I wanted to bring Baroness Casey's report into the conversation because it seems to me that, should we say, the less thoughtful members of my profession, members of the British media writing and commenting on this today, are in complete denial about the existence of the Casey report when it comes to the state of the Met. And some of the issues pertinent to this conversation in particular. But I guess the deeper your prejudice is, the more important it is never to let the light in. And thank you to Hannah for bringing so much light to this conversation. It is 10:36 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, you'll have noted the quality of calls so far, but I have to tell you that Jake and Ella, who are answering the phones today, are dealing with people who apparently didn't hear me explain why we cannot go into any of the details of the case of the man who died during a police operation in South London last year. That's all I'm going to say. And I accept to repeat that I'm not clear what I can and can't say about the Home Secretary's intervention on this issue, because I think she might have flirted with the contempt of court. Just apropos something else that I mentioned to you about, is you may have noticed a sort of career crisis kicking in a bit in recent weeks when I talk about what happens in this profession, in those of us lucky enough to get paid for our opinions, and how many people don't seem to feel any sense of responsibility to understand basic facts. So talking about poverty denial, which seems to be coming back into fashion at the moment, the pensions and the Money and Pension Service, MAPS, which I think is a quango, did some research towards the end of last year that found 9 million people across the UK have no savings at all, right? And another 5 million have less than £100. So that's 14 million people who have either no savings at all or have less than £100. So the idea that there are millions of people in this country who cannot buy essentials if an unexpected demand upon their money is made in a given week, month or day should not really confuse or baffle anybody. There is no excuse for not understanding those very, very, very basic numbers. So it's a quarter of adults have less than £100 put away. So if you need a new tyre on your car, if you're somehow able to run one in that way, or if you need to replace a broken window, or if you need, God forbid, a boiler or something like that, the idea that you... Well, anyway, I don't think I need to explain it any further. 10:38 is the time. Back to the handing in of cards, a sort of downing of weapons, metaphorically speaking, by many, many armed officers. The first time since 1919 that policing roles across the capital could be undertaken by armed soldiers. I'll be clear on that. It's a replacement of armed police as opposed to a complement or a supplement to armed police. It's 10:39. Io is in Romford. Io, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
I know that you can't talk about the case directly.
Don't say but. If you say but now, I'm cutting you straight off. All right?
No.
All right.
So I won't say anything about the case. I'll talk in very generic terms, okay?
Yeah.
So I'll answer your question directly first, right, which is, should the police have scrutiny or more scrutiny? Or I think definitely they should have a minimum of the scrutiny that, you know, a member of the public would have. But actually, with the state of the police, with the Casey report, et cetera, I think actually they should probably have a little bit more scrutiny, okay?
Yes, but they've got some reputational rehabilitation to undertake, but I don't know if the law works like that. I don't know if
it needs to be done in the context of their job.
Yes.
Obviously, their job is a very difficult job. It's a high-pressure job, a high-skilled job, but they definitely need to have context of it. I am very, very disgusted, actually, by Suella Braverman.
Get careful.
I'm not going to say anything.
Because
about
you can leave it there. I think we all are. Just every day, not just every day. This time last week, a month ago, a year ago, absolutely disgusted by Suella
I'm going to say
Braverman.
something a little bit controversial about the police officers who have quit. Okay,
yeah, okay, that's fine.
I'm quite disgusted by them as well, to be honest. And the reason why I'm disgusted by them as well is they understand, like we all do, right? The CPS have had a look at all the evidence. They have decided independently that there should be a trial. It doesn't mean the officer's guilty. It doesn't mean that he's innocent.
No, you're veering. Go on.
Okay, so when a trial happens, we'll see all the facts. They'll put their side across. And the jury should make a decision. I think by, them all handing their weapons, it's just, it's disrespectful. You know what, right, James? You close your eyes. Think about this. God forbid, but your child got shot by a police officer, right? Suella Braverman said what she says.
Yeah, careful. Equally, imagine you're the officer. Close your eyes. And what the objection is, officers are telling me, some of whom are not comfortable ringing in, but who are sending me quite detailed texts, including this one. This is absolutely not about police officers not being investigated when they charge firearms or other circumstances. We all want accountability because we want the people we serve to trust us. It is about how those investigations take place, the threshold that police officers exercising their duty with all that training your previous caller referred to are held up against compared to that of an ordinary person. The CPS, when charging an ordinary person, has an 80% conviction rate. When they charge a police officer, that rate drops to 30%. I haven't checked these figures, which suggests that the threshold for charges is lower for a police officer than it is for other people. This is what is causing concern, and also the speed with which the investigation takes place. The Commissioner's letter in full actually outlines all of the concerns that firearms officers have. So it's not just throwing toys out of the pram. The speed at which police are investigated needs to be faster, and the threshold at which the IOPC become involved needs to be higher. So it's a little bit more nuanced than perhaps you allow, IO.
No, James, you know why I disagree with that text here? The main reason why I disagree with that text is if the police officers quit after the trial was done, whatever the result was, right? They quit after.
So when all the facts are known and when a verdict has been handed down,
I would have a lot more respect for them. Yeah, I would understand. Okay, but but
they would say we know more than you do already. We know a lot more than you do already.
Yeah, but there's no way they can know every single thing. I'm sure they haven't seen the footage. It's just rumours and speculation.
Well, again, I'm just going to be overcautious rather than undercautious for the purposes of this conversation, because you're inevitably going in into the specifics, which we are not looking at, and it's my fault that, because you can't really have a broader conversation about the levels of scrutiny and the thresholds of investigation, and then me shoot you down. Sorry, that's a terrible choice of phrase. Me close you down when you start inevitably examining what the parameters or the limits of that conversation might be. So just to acknowledge that we're all on thin ice here, and I'm not certainly adopting the role of the schoolmaster. 10:43 is the time. Ian is in Crawley. Ian, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James.
Hello.
It was nice to talk to you.
Oh, well, we'll see.
It's a subject, really, that's got me very vexed, which is not unusual listening to your programme.
Go on.
I am a retired inspector from the Metropolitan Police, retired 5 years ago, thankfully. I'm ashamed of what's going on at the present time. Sure. During my career, I was in professional standards and a firearms commander. And I wanted to highlight some issues around a perception that there seems to be a lack of justification and that police officers aren't open to any scrutiny.
Yeah, go on.
And that starts with the use of force. I mean, let's face it, London's a dangerous place, regrettably. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of firearms incidents in London every year. Ask yourself how many times police discharge firearms. But they are subject to scrutiny in as much as every time a weapon is drawn, technically that's a use of force, and the officer drawing that weapon will write reams and reams and reams justifying why they've done so.
Yes.
And that escalates in proportion to the level of force used. So if a shot is fired, the officer is required to justify that level of force even more. So there is already an inbuilt level of justification and scrutiny. But what I really wanted to mention was when I was, and I won't go anywhere near the current case. I want to refer to a case that was well over 20 years old. I can provide dates and names if that's appropriate, but at the moment I will anonymise it.
Okay.
In my role as professional standards inspector, I was dealing with a case which was supervised by the Police Complaints Authority, which was loosely connected to a public order incident in Brixton, which followed a police shooting. And before I went in to see my supervising member, the DCI I was with met a chap he knew who was the deputy chair of the Police Complaints Authority.
Right.
Now, these are very influential people. They arc straight into the Home Office, the Home Secretary, the DPP, and we were asking each other how our respective investigations were going. Yeah. He was supervising the shooting, and he said he was incredibly frustrated. Now, 3 officers had each taken the view that a particular individual presented a danger and shot him dead.
Right.
The deputy chair of the Police Complaints Authority at the time was expressing his frustration in as much as the officers wrote reams and reams and reams justifying what they'd done, but they had refused to answer any more of his questions. Now, that questioning would have taken place under criminal caution.
Right.
And the first thing you tell anybody, whether they be a police officer
you have the right to remain
or
silent.
not, you have the right to remain silent.
Yeah.
So they were exercising their lawful right.
God.
And that frustrated that. He was incredibly angry about that. And he said he would do his utmost to ensure that those officers grip the rail in a criminal trial for murder.
Right.
Now, I found that quite alarming.
Well, I do as well. Why did you? What is it? Because you think that police are being denied rights that are afforded to every other member of society, or potentially being denied rights, or someone was expressing a desire to deny them those rights? Yes.
It was quite clear from that remark that it was seekers' rights. It was quite clear that he wasn't necessarily being altogether that objective by expressing a desire for them to face a murder trial.
And yet some people listening will be very much of the view that police officer, is it quis custodes or Latin to that effect, in that the standards possibly should be higher for people who are allowed to carry guns on the street than they are for people who are not. Well,
the standards are already incredibly high in terms of training, in terms of justification. That former female officer expressed herself fantastically well,
did, yes.
I thought, and kind of touched on all those points. There's already a huge amount of scrutiny.
So what's the key? What do you think? And I don't want to run out of time. So what is the key for you? What is the key grievance? Generally speaking, because what we can say is this case has brought into relief a much bigger grievance that goes far beyond any individual case, and that is what has prompted people to hand in their cards. What would that grievance be?
I think there is a sense that there are hidden agendas, and people are more than happy to make their already very difficult professional lives intolerable, and that they have no faith that they are being treated fairly.
Okay, and that is
principally because of that remark that I drew your attention to.
Going earlier. Right back for you 20 years to evidence of perhaps a hidden agenda, or not even hidden in the way that you told the story in. And I'm very grateful to you for doing so carefully and so responsibly. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need to contribute to this conversation is 0345 6060 973. It's 10:49. 10:53 is the time. Thank you for helping me conduct this conversation in informative, illuminating, but also a responsible fashion. Time for at least a couple more calls. Let's go to Plymouth. Mike is there. Mike, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James. So I'm a former police firearms commander myself. Never carried a firearm, but was a commander. And just to build on some of the points that your previous callers made, really. So first thing to say is absolutely police should be scrutinised in the event of an incident like this. And all the firearms officers I worked with in the 5 years that I performed the role absolutely understood that and didn't have an issue with it. But I think it's important to say that the landscape is possibly changing a little bit. So there was a ruling recently, and it was another firearms case, whereby Court of Appeal ruled that honestly held belief has always been something that officers, when they use force, can rely upon because of the nature of hindsight and split-second decisions and making the best decisions in the heat of the moment. That if they act with an honestly held belief and the circumstances can justify that, then it may well be deemed appropriate. And the proof of that was beyond reasonable doubt. A recent Court of Appeal ruling pushed that down to balance of probabilities. So it may well be that, depending on where this case goes, I'm not going obviously to discuss that, but where that goes, there may be a slightly shifting of the goalposts. And what I would anticipate, I know it's been framed as a sort of rebellion, protest potentially by the Met officers, but I would suspect they know the broad context of what took place that day, and it's a set of circumstances very broadly.
That may be pertinent to the point you've just raised. I mean, reading the letter that Mark Rowley sent to the Home Secretary, it goes down a slightly different path, but I guess the difference between the broader picture and the specifics is what we all have to be careful of this morning. I want to run something by you that,
yes,
and it's going to be quite a sensitive point that I make,
okay.
and I think there's a chance you won't like it. But when I hear the phrase split-second decisions under high pressure, which I think you said, or certainly words to that effect, that a lot of people contributing to this discourse have pointed this out quite rightly, that what you're nudging towards or nodding at there is almost a presumption of virtue, which I touched on in my introduction. Because these people have chosen this course, because they run towards danger when the rest of us run away from it, we as a society, we impute virtue. We allow a presumption of virtue, which is challenged by what Baroness Casey had to say, specifically about MO19. But it's also challenged for a lot of people in 2023 by the fact that Wayne Couzens and David Carrick were armed police officers. So the presumption of virtue for me is probably weaker than it's ever been in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, I absolutely take the point. I wouldn't say presumption of virtue. What I would say is the specific circumstances of, because as your callers have already amply
because making a split-second decision under high pressure is not about specific circumstances. That's a broad brushstroke generalisation that, whether intentionally or not, opens the door to the possibility of, because it is so high pressure and because it is so split second, you should give these guys a break.
No.
Yes.
So if they if what they see unfolding in front of them, so for instance, you referenced a case right back at the start, a long time ago now, where someone with a table, what police officers believed at the time was a firearm, but it turned out to be a table leg. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking about, is where they react to circumstances where they believe that person has a weapon or is undertaking a course of action which forces them into a situation where they have to make that decision. So I'm really talking about those, and if it can't
although
be justified,
that case was found to be, that killing was found to be unlawful. It was crikey, Harry Stanley was his name.
Stanley, yes.
Yeah. That was unlawful.
So it's that,
even under the old system of under the old system of beyond reasonable doubt, that was found to be unlawful. So
it's just difficult because it's not dealing with people. It's not an exact science. But I absolutely take your point, because firearms is absolutely the sharpest end, because it's the old, potentially you pull that trigger, you take someone's life, and that is the ultimate scenario with it. But it's just when you're there, all firearms operations are designed to prevent escalation to that point. It's so well controlled. It's all about.
It's almost as if some officers feel, and I think you've all nodded towards this. It's almost as if it feels that there's a presumption of guilt until you can prove yourselves innocent in these sort of situations, and that does feel unfair, and that would be, I think, pretty close to the central grievance, the threshold for investigation, the likelihood of conviction post-prosecution, the time that it takes for these decisions to be reached, it feels as if the cards are stacked against the officers, and that grievance is magnified by the danger that they face daily. And I completely understand that. And I think we've managed to reflect most angles on this issue without, of course, exploring the specifics of the case that has prompted the surrendering of the blue card firearms status. So thank you to everybody, Mike and everybody else this hour. In the next hour, if I say HS2, what do you say? Oh, you can say what you want this hour. Anything you want, seriously. I mean, ideally about HS2, but if you want to ring in and tell me what you had for tea last night or your favourite biscuit, that would be acceptable too. Oh, it's not good for my blood pressure, walking that tightrope of contempt of court. But I felt it was an important conversation to have, not least because the withdrawal of labour, if you like, by armed police officers. They're not, of course, allowed to go on strike, but they are legally permitted to hand in their guns, metaphorically speaking. It takes its toll. So I don't know that we've done it. When's the last time we had a conversation about HS2? Is it one of those topics about which you either know nothing or everything? And a lot of the people who think they know everything actually turn out to know nothing. Who knows everything? Who really is qualified to talk about HS2? Listen, here's what I know. It's very, very, very expensive. It's gone way over budget, and it's about to go even more over budget because of inflation. So, weirdly, the cost... So, something quite funny, or funny, not quite the right word, but if you ever come across a Brexiter pointing at export figures and saying, look, services have gone up, they're missing the difference between volume and value. It's a great piece in the Grocer magazine today. I've told you before, the trade mags are the best place to go for proper news at the moment because they don't have any... axis to grind, but value change versus volume change. So imagine I'm exporting one apple, right, to France. I'm sending an apple to France, and that apple is worth £1. So Apple exports to France by JOB Inc. this week amounted to £1, right? Apple exports to France amounted to £1. Now imagine that because of the cost of living and inflation and red tape and labour costs and the rest of it, it now costs £2. So the French are going to have to pay me £2 for my apple. Apple exports to France by JOB Inc. this week amounted to £2. But there's still only one apple. That's why it's very important to look at value change versus volume change when you want to understand what's actually happening to our trade and our export. And the Grocer today paints a very bleak picture of what is actually happening across almost all sectors. Volume change, whiskey's down 20%. Do you know who predicted that Brexit would be terrible for the whiskey exports of these islands? Do you know who predicted that when he was Chief Executive of the Scotch Whisky Association? I may have got his job title wrong. Do you not know? Just going to knock your socks off this. Guess who predicted that correctly that Brexit would be catastrophic for the Scotch whisky exports, or whisky exports in general, when he was Chief Executive of the Scotch Whisky Association? Yeah, a bloke called David Frost, who is now, of course, in the House of Lords, having negotiated the Brexit so-called deal that some prunes still think was worthy of celebration. Cheese is down 3% on volume. 3%. That is a disgrace. So we're exporting less cheese than we did before, less chocolate, that's down 16.3%, less fish, salmon is down 9.6%. Breakfast cereals, big market apparently, £350 million market. That's one of the ones that's actually gone up in value. So you could argue that we're now exporting more breakfast cereal than ever before. You'd be wrong. You'd have to say we're exporting more... What's the word you want to describe it? So you're exporting in financial terms, the market has grown by about 8.4%, but we're actually exporting 11.2% less breakfast cereal. So do you see the difference between volume and value? It's really interesting, this stuff. Seriously. Soft drinks stayed about the same, would you believe? Although the value, so we're exporting the same amount of soft drinks, but it's costing 10% more. So people claim exports have gone up, but we're exporting the same amount for 10%. Well, anyway, I mention all of that in the context of HS2 because when they review the figures, inflation will mean that what would have been 50 billion last year will be 60 billion next year, even though it's the same. You get the picture, right? George Osborne and Michael Heseltine joined forces today to call upon their Conservative successors not to pull the plug on HS2, the Manchester link, which is odd, really, given that it's all blue on blue, this fight. It would be an act of huge economic self-harm, say George Osborne and Michael Heseltine, and be a decision of such short-sightedness that we urge the Prime Minister, don't do it. How could you ever again claim to be levelling up when you cancel the biggest levelling up project? How could you claim to be taking difficult decisions for the long term when you abandon the single largest piece of infrastructure the country is building? 0345 606 0973 is the number that you need if you have a view on this. And I'm going to do something I don't do very often on the programme. I'm almost going to leave it there. Seriously, what's your view? I'll ask you. I reserve the right to ask you what it's based on. My gut reaction, I don't know enough. I know nothing really. I travel by train a lot. It's getting worse all the time. I know that HS2 is about capacity. At least as much, if not more than speed. So all the usual idiots would have been banging on about, it's going to shave 20 minutes off the journey from what's the point of that? It's not about that. It's about capacity. If we are keen to get people out of their cars and into other modes of transport, then the railway infrastructure in this country needs to be massively improved. The construction industry is queuing up to warn against the dangers of not going through with it to its fullest effect. You've got a Tory donor, I think it's the JCB bloke who used to have Boris Johnson living in his garden. Did you read about that? But lots of rich people have things like peacocks in their gardens or llamas to show how rich they are. Usually peacocks. I don't know that llamas are a particular status symbol, but you have a peacock strolling around your grounds. Anthony Bamford, the head of JCB, had a prime minister. He had a former prime minister living in a house in his garden. I mean, they don't say in his garden, do they? Rip up sort of toffs like that. They say on his estate or something like that. But I can just imagine him having breakfast with some guests and you know, they say, look over there, there's a peacock. Oh, look, there's Boris Johnson. It's quite pathetic, really, what we've been reduced to as a nation by some of these characters. But he's very cross about the prospect of pulling the plug on HS2, presumably because there's a lot of work involved for his company. Justin Greening gave it the green light in 2012. She was a Tory, but it was under Labour in 2009 that the company was set up to develop plans for it. The budget then was £37.5 billion. The budget now, I'd have to double check, but it is considerably more than £37.5 billion. And there is logically a point at which you probably should pull the plug. It's such a weird thing, isn't it? A sunk cost fallacy. The idea that because you've already spent so much, you shouldn't stop. But there is obviously a logical argument that there has to be a point at which you've already spent so much you can't justify spending any more. But that doesn't mean it applies to HS2. Let me run through the timescale for you. There were judicial reviews and attempts to stop it. I mean, are people... forgive me for not knowing this stuff, but nobody's perfect. Are there people who have had their house compulsorily purchased who are now facing the possibility that the bit of the line that was going to go where their house used to be is now not going to be built? Because that would hurt, wouldn't it? How much? I mean, do we know the answer to that question? I'd be pretty cross if I'd had to sell my house against my will. I hadn't wanted to move, even if I got a good price for it. And then a few years down the line, the government turned around and said, we're not building it anyway. You said, can I have my house back? Sorry, mate, knocked it down. But you're not built. So I don't know. What I'm doing now is attempting to be mildly amusing while illustrating to you the fact that I'm not exaggerating my ignorance of this issue in any way, shape or form. As someone who is I'll tell you one thing I am quite well qualified on, and that is the size of the country, the difference between the North and the Midlands and London, all of which I travel routinely by rail. And there are parts of the North, and the links from east to west, you know, from York to Manchester, across the Pennines. It is a completely different universe in terms of public transport provision once you get outside London. It's a bit better in the big cities than it is elsewhere. But the idea of linking up the engine of London to other parts of the country and devolving, of course, some of the commerce as well is I would have thought really, really attractive. But what do I know? Where are we now? So June 2022, They scrapped the West Coast, the Goulburn link to the West Coast main line. March 2023, parts of the project were put on hold for 2 years because of inflation. They pushed back work on the Euston terminal, which means trains will leave and arrive from Old Oak Common in northwest London. That's a little bit insane to me. Again, I know nothing, and I'm about to open the phone lines for people who know more. But having it stop in the middle of nowhere, and it's about 500 metres north of Willesden Junction. It's not nowhere, right? But it's a bit weird to stop it there rather than bringing it into a major transport hub with links, in the case of Euston, directly to the Midlands, directly to Birmingham. And then you've got this weird flip-flopping by the government, which the weekend noise, the mood music this weekend was that they're going to pull the plug. And then the minister that was put up this morning, I don't know what they're going to do, save it for the budget? I mean, we don't even know. Uncertainty is supposed to be the enemy of stability, isn't it? No one's got a flipping clue what's going on. Are they going to pull the plug on it? I honestly don't know. But I'm not mad about trusting people like this with the key questions or the decisions. Is it Rachel Maclean? Is that her name? The minister who was doing the rounds this morning. Have a little listen to this clip of her talking on The Breakfast Show. See if you can spot what's wrong with it. Go on.
I would make the point that we have got 100,000 houses that we could be building if it wasn't for the unelected Labour Party, actually encouraged by Keir Starmer, who whipped his colleagues to vote against our very sensible plans to deviate from the defective EU laws.
Just once again, we'll have another listen to that. See if you can spot why it gave me chills to think that this person is now a senior minister in a government. Just see if you can, single word, text me if you spot it. There's one word in this little exchange that if she was a football manager, she'd be fired by lunchtime. Have a listen to this.
I would make the point that we have got 100,000 houses that we could be building if it wasn't for the unelected Labour Party, actually encouraged by Keir Starmer, who whipped his colleagues to vote against our very sensible plans to deviate from the defective EU laws.
The unelected Labour Party. Sorry, I spoiled the competition there. The unelected... How does she think Labour MPs got into the House of Commons? Like a tombola? That's quite remarkable. I don't know if you want to talk about unelected. When did Rishi Sunak get a mandate from the British people to be Prime Minister? He's the one who put her in the cabinet. Is she in the cabinet? Well, she's a minister anyway. Anyway, look, well done. Everyone spotted unelected. I shouldn't have given it away. It would have been quite fun to play that game for a bit longer. But it's 11:15 and we can't. So I'm going to open up the phone lines. I find this really interesting, but I don't know much about it. Now, not many subjects are like that. Often the more I learn about something, the more or the less interesting it becomes. HS2 by 12 o'clock today might be the most boring phone-in we've done in weeks. Or it might be a really interesting one. I can't make any predictions because I don't know enough about it. What I do know is this. It's not finished, it's cost a ton of money, and the government are toying with the idea of cutting their losses, as they would describe it, and not going ahead with it. Cautiously, that seems to me to be the worst of all possible worlds. Because if you objected to it on environmental grounds, you've already lost, and then you're not going to get the payoff, which would have been the rail link. If you objected to it on other grounds, you perhaps will celebrate, but most of it is still going to be there. So the idea of not seeing it through to fruition seems to me to be silly. But what do I know? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. If you hit those numbers now, you will get through. It's 11:16. It's 11:19. So, again, it probably illustrating my ignorance more than anything else. If they don't build the Manchester to Birmingham bit of HS2, does that mean we've got a link essentially from Willesden to Birmingham? It seems a bit there's got to be more to it than that, but I think the figure is £71 billion? £71 billion it's cost so far, with an original estimate of 35 billion. And for that 71 billion, you're going to get less than was originally mooted when it was launched, because they've already abandoned some bits of it. What's going on? Is the short question. This is how the Evening Standard reports the morning's events. A minister sparked fresh confusion on Monday over the future of HS2 as a backlash grew over shelving the Birmingham to Manchester link of the high-speed railway. Housing Minister Rachel Maclean initially said the decision had been put back until the Chancellor's autumn statement on November the 22nd, despite weekend reports that an announcement could be made as soon as this week, ahead of the Conservatives' annual conference in Manchester next week. There's a rail strike as well at the weekend, timed, I think, to coincide with the Conservative conference in Manchester. So they'll get a bit of a introduction to the state of the railways, won't they? Or not. Rob's in Rotherham. Rob, what made you pick up the phone, mate?
Because I'm just bored of this whole rhetoric about HS2 ever being anything other than pushing the wealth from London. So I truly believe that HS2 was always meant to go to Birmingham and nowhere else. And if you look at the facts around it, you can see it. So, for example, I phoned in to say that in Doncaster, as soon as HS2 was mentioned, they built a state-of-the-art college. Now it's called the National College for Advanced Transport and Infrastructure. There hasn't been a single student at that college because it's never been used. In fact, in April, it was announced before it ever actually opened that they're closing it.
Okay, this is
there.
I'm slightly wary of. I don't know why you're telling me that.
Well, it was sold as this big thing.
But it's got a campus in Birmingham as well, not just Doncaster.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's not coming to Doncaster. And like you asked earlier, you asked the question: have people's houses been compulsory purchased?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. People up north.
No, I know, but what are you telling me, Rob, about today's developments? Is it good or bad? Well, hang on, you can't answer the question until I'm asked it. Is it good or bad that they might be calling off this bit of it? Is it good or bad?
They've already called it off.
They haven't.
They have.
They haven't.
Right, okay, so in that case, then why have they already implemented a faster rail structure over the Pennines between Sheffield and Manchester?
The Birmingham to Manchester link, as of today, I knew this was going to happen. It's not your fault, Rob. It's just one of those subjects, isn't it? So the Birmingham to Manchester link, as it stands, during this conversation between Rob in Rotherham and me at 22 minutes after 11 on Monday, September the 25th, 2023, is going ahead.
Okay.
The suggestion this weekend is they might announce that it's not.
I think it's...
But Phase 2A and Phase 2B, Phase 2A and Phase 2B, which are the bits that you're referring to, have gone ahead and have cost millions, if not billions of pounds. So that's why I'm a little bit confused about what you think you're telling me.
Well, I just don't believe that it was ever meant to come up here.
Yeah, but that just sounds mad, mate.
Why?
Well, it's a conspiracy theory.
Right. Yeah, no, we can say, but that's the problem at the moment, especially for us that live up the north. Everything's a conspiracy theory.
No, just the idea that they've announced it, built a lot of it, but never intended to open it. That's the only thing I'm calling a conspiracy theory about.
Up north.
Well, Birmingham's not even the north. Birmingham's the Midlands, mate.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying.
What?
Up north. I've always known that train is not coming up here.
Right.
We knew that it was going to stop in Birmingham because if you look at places like Milton Keynes, Milton Keynes is literally now all the poor people who can't afford to live in London, and that's been pushed further.
But everyone, so why did they tell the fib then? Because all it's going to do is cause enormous grievance and upset. Why did they even announce it if they weren't intending to do it? I do think this is bonkers, but I'm going to humour you. All right.
Well, I'll give you. I'll give you a humorous thing then.
Is it from up north?
No, because I can clearly tell you don't think there's a north-south divide. Blah blah blah.
I certainly do think there's a north-south divide. Blah blah blah. There's a clear north-south. There's a huge north-south divide. I'm just wondering why, given that not doing it would cause such upset, why they announced that they were going to do it while always intending not to, Rob?
Because it makes them sound like they actually care about the North and not just London.
No, it doesn't, though. It does the opposite of that. If they announce it and then don't deliver it, it does the opposite of...
Because then, like Rishi Sunak did the other day, then they just come out and blame the working class people for it.
They're going to blame the working class people for not building HS2.
Yeah, because we're
How's that going to work? How are they going to do it? Rob, mate, you need to give your head a wobble, mate.
Okay, well, I'll give you an example.
Well, go on then.
The other day,
Mr.
Sunak went on national television.
Yes.
And he said, right, unfortunately, because we're poor, we can no longer look after the climate. It's not going to be a thing anymore, unfortunately. We're pushing all our targets back.
All right.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, I would argue...
Would you?
That should have been
done in the Houses of Parliament.
Well, I would as well, but I don't know what I would as well. But that doesn't prove a north-south divide or blaming the working class for anything. I mean, you're just saying things now, all the right things, but not necessarily in the right order, Rob.
Right. So, what about all the money that is wasted?
Why do you keep moving around? The question's really simple. If the plan all along was not to open the Birmingham to Manchester link, why have they spent millions of pounds on it already? And why did they announce it at all, given that all it's going to do is give people up north the hump?
Well, because we're used to it.
That's not an answer to my question. The words "because we're used to it" bear no relation to the words "why did he do it?"
Understand.
All right. Well, listen, I'm happy to stand corrected on this, but in order to do so, I would have to understand at least part of what you were saying. And at the moment, I don't. Pressure's on David in Washington now to rescue the HS2 phone in. David, what would you like to say?
Well, first off, James, good morning. We've spoken about sunk cost fallacy before, you and I, and this is not one of those situations. Sunk cost fallacy applies to cons, Ponzi schemes, Brexit.
You're quite right. No, I stand corrected.
The concept is just it's not
because it's the word fallacy, isn't it? That's the point. This is not a fallacy. This is real. It exists, and it's an exchange of goods and services for cash.
Yes. So this is real.
Sorry, you're right.
My main point is, living in the northeast, I just don't understand why these projects start in the south first. If they were going to level up and prove this was a levelling up project, right? Why was the concentration on the Midlands to London link first? Why didn't it start in Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester?
Because you'd need the bit. You need the bit from Midlands to London in order to get from the north to London. So I
don't want to get to London, James. This is the issue. Why we're trying to race to London? If we're levelling up, we're wanting to make transport in the north easier across the north, around the north.
This is not necessarily the topic that I thought we were going to be discussing today.
Okay.
Because that was about the wisdom or otherwise of calling off the Birmingham to Manchester bit.
Okay.
But the question of what they should have done instead. So you'd have gone in hard on Leeds and Edinburgh, would you?
Whatever. I mean, we're still waiting for the A1 levelling up. We're still waiting for the A1 to be duelled north of Newcastle.
Yeah,
I know,
but again,
there's a list of things that should have been done. There's
a list of topics I'm never going to go near again, and you're very close to putting HS2 on it.
Right. Okay.
I don't want to. Listen, you're pushing me into a position now where I very nearly said I don't care about the A1 outside Newcastle, but that's how Alan Partridge got cancelled by farmers, and I'm not going to fall into that trap.
I drove yesterday from Manchester to the northeast on the M62 on a Sunday.
Yes.
Absolutely heaving.
That's immigration. That's immigration. Nigel Farage told me a few years ago. It's all about immigration. All right, so we need a train, but we disagree about where it should be.
Yeah, everywhere.
And how would you personally greet the announcement in the budget, if it does come to pass, that they are scrapping the Manchester bit?
Absolutely appalling.
Right.
Okay. I believe, I agree with Michael Heseltine. That's something I thought I would never hear myself.
I usually agree with Michael Heseltine. Post
Thatcher. I suppose once he's resigned and once he's got once he's sort of living in the real world.
So where would a cancelled HS2, he asks in the Times today, leave the North and the Midlands? Abandoned is the answer. They have been encouraged, and in turn they encourage the private sector to spend large sums preparing for it. This is an insult to the many years they have put into preparing for the HS2 line that central governments have repeatedly promised them. So it's a kick in the goolies to the North and the Midlands.